My name is Walter Kowalski, and at 64 years old, I had made peace with the idea that the rest of my life would be quiet. Not lonely, exactly just quiet. The kind of quiet that settles into a house after decades of noise, after children grow up and move away, after a wife of 31 years loses her battle with something that doesn't care how good a person she was. Margaret passed in the spring of 2019, and for 2 years after that, I filled my days the way a man does when he doesn't know what else to do. I worked. I showed up early and I stayed late, and I told myself that was enough. The work, for me, was the hardware store on Elgin Street in Ottawa that I had owned since 1987, Kowalski's Home and Trade Supply. 36 years of early mornings and inventory counts, and knowing every contractor in the city by their first name. When Margaret was alive, she used to joke that I loved that store more than I loved her. I always told her she was wrong. She would smile and say she knew that. She was just giving me a hard time. That was Margaret. She gave me a hard time about everything, and I miss every single second of it. The thing about the store was that nobody knew I owned it. That sounds strange, I realize. Let me explain. In 2017, on the advice of my accountant and my lawyer, I restructured everything into a holding company called Northbridge Property Holdings. My son from my first marriage, Daniel, was listed as the operations manager on paper for tax purposes, though he lived in Vancouver and had nothing to do with the day-to-day. The store itself, the building, and 3 other commercial properties I had acquired over the years were all held under Northbridge. For anyone looking from the outside, I was just the longtime manager of the store, Walter, the guy who knew where the lag bolts were and could tell you the difference between a brad nailer and a finish nailer without looking it up. I kept it that way deliberately. Margaret had always said that the moment people know what you have, they stop seeing you and start seeing it. She was a wise woman. After she passed, I thought about retiring, selling everything, moving somewhere smaller, maybe one of the smaller towns along the Ottawa Valley where we used to drive on Sunday afternoons. But I wasn't ready. The store was routine, and routine was the only thing keeping me functional. So I kept showing up, kept wearing the same green work vest I'd worn for 20 years, kept helping customers figure out what they needed, and the years moved on without me noticing much. I met Diane Beaumont in the fall of 2021 at a grief support group at a community center on Carling Avenue. She had lost her husband, a man named Gerald, to a heart attack 18 months before. She was 58 years old, originally from Sudbury, with 2 adult children, a son named Tyler who was 32 and worked in sales, and a daughter named Kristen who was 29 and had recently gone through a difficult divorce of her own. Diane was warm and funny in the careful way that people who have been through grief become funny, like they've decided laughter is the only reasonable response to how hard everything is. We started as friends. Coffee after the Thursday evening sessions, walks along the canal when the weather was decent. She knew I worked at a hardware store, and she thought that was endearing. She used to call me her handyman friend and ask me questions about her condo renovations, and I would answer them honestly, and she would say she could never have figured that out on her own. I should tell you that I was careful. After 31 years with Margaret, I knew what a real relationship felt like, and I also knew I was vulnerable in a way I hadn't been since I was a young man. I told myself I was just being friendly. I told myself that right up until the moment, about 8 months in, when I realized I was thinking about her constantly, and I had started cleaning my house on Saturday mornings in case she stopped by. We started dating properly in the summer of 2022. She was good company, and I was happy. I introduced her to Daniel over a video call, and he said she seemed nice, but asked me privately to be careful. I told him I was always careful. He said that wasn't the same thing as being careful about this particular thing. I should have listened more closely to that. I want to be fair. The first year was genuinely good. Diane was attentive and kind. She came to the store a few times to bring me lunch, and she always chatted with my employees and remembered their names the next time. She asked me questions about my life, about Margaret, about the years before, and she seemed genuinely interested in the answers. I let myself believe, carefully and cautiously, that maybe this was real. I proposed in September of 2023. Nothing elaborate dinner at a restaurant on Spark Street that Margaret and I had never gone to together, because I was conscious of not wanting to overlap those 2 parts of my life. I had a ring that had belonged to my mother. Diane said yes, and she cried, and I thought the tears were the good kind. 2 weeks later, everything changed. I was at the store on a Tuesday morning, just past opening, when my assistant manager Priya came to find me in the back. She had a look on her face that I had only seen once before, when we'd discovered a water main had burst under the parking lot. Controlled alarm. The kind of face someone makes when they don't want to be the one telling you what they're about to tell you. She said, "Walter, there's a woman up front asking to speak with the owner." I said I would be right there, and Priya said, "She says she is the owner." I came around the corner of the aisle and found Diane standing at the customer service counter, wearing a blazer I hadn't seen before, her hair done in a way she usually reserved for occasions. Standing beside her was Tyler, her son, in a suit jacket, holding a thin leather portfolio. They were both looking around the store with an expression I can only describe as proprietary, like they were measuring the walls. She looked at me and her expression did something complicated. A flash of something not guilt. Exactly. More like recalibration. And then she smiled. "Walter," she said, "I'm glad you're here. We should talk." I said, "All right. Come to my office." My office was a room at the back that most people would call a large closet. A desk, 2 chairs, shelves of binders. Not impressive. Tyler looked at it briefly and seemed to find it consistent with what he had expected. Diane sat down. Tyler stood beside her. I sat across from them and I did not say anything, because in my experience, when you don't know what's coming, the best thing to do is let it arrive without interruption. She reached into Tyler's portfolio and placed a document on the desk. She slid it toward me. "Gerald had a friend in commercial real estate," she said. "We've been doing some research over the past few months. This building has been on the rental market, and we've moved forward on a long-term lease." I looked at the document. It was a lease agreement. The landlord listed was something called Rideau Commercial Ventures. The tenant was Diane Beaumont, operating as Beaumont Home and Hardware. The term was 20 years. The rental amount was below market. I read the whole thing carefully. Tyler shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "There's also the matter of the business itself," Diane continued. Her voice was steady. She had clearly rehearsed this. "We've spoken with a lawyer about the transition of operations. Given that you've been the manager here for a long time without any formal ownership stake, and given that we're now engaged, it seems like the practical step is to formalize the arrangement with me taking over ownership of the business going forward. You could stay on in a consulting capacity, of course, part-time." The room was very quiet for a moment. I picked up the document and looked at it again. "Rideau Commercial Ventures," I said. "Who is that?" "It's a numbered company," Tyler said. He seemed to feel this was a satisfying answer. "And who did you sign this lease with?" I asked. "A property manager," Diane said. "A man named Fournier. He said he represented the building owners." I set the document down. I folded my hands on the desk. I looked at my fiancée and her son, and I thought about the 8 months of coffee and canal walks and lunches brought to the store. I thought about how she had asked me, on 3 separate occasions, whether I had ever thought about what I would do with the store if I retired, and how I had always said I hadn't decided yet. I thought about how Tyler had taken me for coffee 4 months ago and asked me, almost casually, whether the building was rented or owned, and I had said rented, and he had nodded and not asked anything else. I thought about how carefully the whole thing had been constructed. "I think," I said, "that I should make a phone call." I took out my phone and called my lawyer, a man named Stuart Abernethy, who had been handling my affairs since 1995. I had him on speaker. "Stu," I said, "I'm sitting here with my fiancée and her son. They've produced a lease agreement for my store at the Elgin Street address. The agreement names a company called Rideau Commercial Ventures as landlord. Can you tell me who owns Rideau Commercial Ventures?" There was a brief pause on the line. "Walter," Stuart said, "Rideau Commercial Ventures is a shell company. It was incorporated 6 weeks ago. It has no actual claim to the property at the Elgin Street address. Northbridge Property Holdings owns that building. You own that building." Tyler's portfolio slid off his knee. I said, "And Northbridge Property Holdings is wholly owned by you," Stuart said. "You are the sole director and shareholder. Do you want me to come down there?" "I'll call you back," I said, and ended the call. The silence in the room was different now. Diane's color had changed. Tyler was staring at the document in front of me like it had betrayed him personally. "Walter," Diane said, "I didn't know." "You knew exactly what you knew," I said. "You knew I worked here. You believed that meant I was an employee. You spent months confirming that belief rather than questioning it because it suited what you were planning. It wasn't like that. Then explain to me what Rito Commercial Ventures is, I said. Explain to me who Fournier is and how he represented a building he has no connection to. Explain to me the deposit that I assume you paid him and where that money went. Her expression shifted from shock into something else. She looked at Tyler. Tyler said, "We can work this out." "There's nothing to work out," I said. "Whatever you paid this man Fournier, you paid to a fraud. I'd suggest reporting it to the police, though I understand that will raise questions about what you were intending to do here. I'd also suggest speaking to your lawyer about what you've signed and what it's actually worth, which is nothing." I stood up. "I'll need the key to the store back," I said to Diane. "I gave you one in August, so you could bring me lunch when I was running late. I'd like it now, please." She took it out of her purse and set it on the desk. "The engagement," she said. "Walter, I'll have the ring returned to you," I said. "It was my mother's, so I'll be keeping that. I'll have my lawyer send you the cubic zirconia equivalent." That last part wasn't something I had planned to say. It came out anyway. I don't entirely regret it. They left. I stood in my small, cluttered office, and I looked at the fake lease agreement on my desk for a long time. Then I called Stuart back and told him the full story. And he told me what my options were. And I told him I didn't want to pursue anything unless I had to. I just wanted it to be over. He said he understood, and he drafted a formal notice of no claim to the Elgin Street property under Beaumont or any Beaumont-associated entity, which was largely symbolic but satisfying to sign. I found out later, through a mutual acquaintance from the grief group, that the man named Fournier had taken a deposit from Diane of $42,000. He had identified himself as a property broker and produced fraudulent documentation. By the time Diane tried to contact him again, his phone number was disconnected and his office address was a postal box. She filed a police report. I don't know what came of it. I thought about all the evenings I had spent with her, all the Saturday morning walks, the dinner on Sparks Street. I thought about whether any of it had been real, and I came to the conclusion that I couldn't know, and that not knowing was a condition I was going to have to accept. The store kept going. Priya, who had worked for me for 11 years, took on more responsibility, and we hired a new assistant. The contractors kept coming in for their lag bolts. November arrived, and then Christmas, and I put up the same lights in the front window that I put up every year, and it was fine. Everything was quietly, acceptably fine. The real surprise came in February. A woman named Evelyn Marchetti brought her father into the store on a Saturday afternoon. Her father, a man named Frank, was 81 and had decided to build raised garden beds for his backyard in the spring. He had very specific ideas about wood grades and corner joinery, and he was delightful to talk to. Evelyn stood nearby, looking slightly overwhelmed by the level of detail her father was requesting. At some point, Frank wandered to look at lumber samples, and Evelyn turned to me and said, "Thank you for your patience. He's been planning these garden beds since October." I said it was genuinely my pleasure, and that I had not talked about corner joinery with anyone who cared that much in years. She laughed. It was the straightforward kind of laugh. Nothing performed about it. We talked for another 20 minutes while Frank compared wood samples. She was 56, recently retired from teaching high school English in Canada for 28 years, and had come back to Ottawa from a few years in Halifax to be closer to her father after her mother passed. She was practical and funny, and she called her father Frank even in front of him, which he clearly found appropriate. When they were leaving, Frank shook my hand and said, "You know your business, son." He was the second person in a month to call me son, the first being my actual son over video call, which I found amusing. Evelyn caught me smiling and raised her eyebrows in a question, and I explained. And she said, "He says that to everyone he approves of. You should feel good." I did feel good. I found out her last name from the credit card receipt, and I debated with myself for 2 weeks about whether it was appropriate to look her up. I decided it was, if I was honest about what I was doing, which was hoping she might come back to the store. She did not come back to the store. I looked up her father's name in the city directory, Frank Marchetti on Rochester Street, which was 8 minutes from the store, and I thought about what I was doing and decided I was acting like a teenager and should stop. What I did instead was go back to the Thursday grief group, which I had stopped attending a year earlier when I started seeing Diane. The facilitator, a woman named Carol, seemed genuinely pleased to see me and did not ask any questions. There were new faces. One of them was Evelyn, who had apparently joined 2 months earlier. She looked at me across the circle of chairs, and then she looked at the ceiling briefly, in a way that said she was recalibrating something, and then she looked back at me with an expression that was, I think, the beginning of something. We did not talk that evening beyond hellos. But she was there the following Thursday, and I was there. And after a few weeks of that, we went for coffee at a place on Bank Street that neither of us had been to before, which felt like the right kind of neutral ground. I told her the truth about myself early, not as a confession, but because I had made a decision after Diane that honesty was not a risk, it was a foundation. I told her I owned the store and the building, and a few other properties. I told her about Northbridge and why I had structured it the way I had. I told her about Diane and about what had happened. I was matter-of-fact about it. I did not perform suffering, and I did not minimize it. She listened to the whole thing. Then she said, "So you deliberately let her think you were just an employee?" I said, "I wasn't ready to tell anyone the whole picture yet. Margaret had died. I was still figuring out who I was without her." Evelyn thought about that for a moment and said, "I understand that." She said it the way someone says something when they mean it. She told me that her marriage had ended 12 years ago, that her ex-husband was a good person, and they were genuinely friendly now, but that they had grown into different people and had eventually had the honesty to admit it. She said she didn't have a dramatic story. She had a quiet one. She was at peace with it. I told her I had spent the last several years around enough drama, and that a quiet story sounded like exactly what I wanted to hear. She smiled into her coffee cup. "We have been seeing each other for 8 months now. I have met Frank 3 more times and helped him design the raised garden beds, which came out extremely well. He calls me Walter, not son, which I understand to be a promotion. Evelyn has met Daniel over video call, and Daniel told me afterward, privately, that she seemed like a person who actually saw me. I thought about that for a while. I think he was right. I am not in a hurry about anything. I have learned the cost of hurrying about things. I know who I am and what I have, and I am not hiding it from anyone, but I am also not announcing it in the first conversation or the 5th. Evelyn knows everything now, and she finds the Northbridge structure admirably boring, which is the most reassuring thing anyone has ever said about it. The store is doing well. The raised garden beds Frank built have become a topic of considerable interest among his neighbors on Rochester Street, and I expect we will have a run on cedar planks and galvanized hardware come April. Life has its small continuities. If there is anything I have learned from the last few years that I think is worth saying plainly, it is this. When you are starting over later in life, do your due diligence on the people you let close to you. Not because people are generally dishonest, but because grief makes us want to believe things are what they seem to be, and that wanting can get ahead of our judgment. Take your time. Watch how a person treats the people who serve them in restaurants, who help them in stores, who have nothing they need. A person who is only kind to people they want something from is not a kind person. They are a strategic one. There is a difference, and it matters enormously. Run a background check if you are serious about someone. I say that not as cynicism, but as practicality. In a country where your pension, your property, and your children's inheritance are all things a bad actor can target, $100 and a conversation with your lawyer is the cheapest insurance you will ever buy. Get a prenuptial agreement drawn up before any engagement. Make sure your assets are structured properly and that your beneficiaries are clearly named and current. These are not unromantic things. They are the things a responsible person does for the people they love and for themselves. And if someone seems wonderful in every setting except when they think nobody important is watching, pay attention to that. That is the real person. Everything else is the blazer they put on for the meeting. Walter Kowalski is still at the store on Elgin Street most mornings. He still wears the green vest. He still knows where the lag bolts are. That is enough. It turns out it always was.